Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hello and welcome to episode 360 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory and my guest today is Ian Long, a British author, illustrator, teacher trainer and creator, best known for co-developing the now iconic visual tool, the Blob Tree, alongside youth worker and author Pip Wilson. Ian spent 17 years as a primary school teacher and has also worked as a graphic artist, youth worker and pastoral worker, a blend of experiences that shaped his passion for using images and non-verbal communication to help people express emotions that words sometimes can't reach. Today, we'll be exploring the story behind the Blob Tree, its applications in counselling and education around the world, and why it remains such a powerful tool for an emotional connection and reflection. So with that said, let's roll the intro.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and a very warm welcome to episode 360 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly. Rory and I are going to be stopping at 3 destinations today, starting with that ethical, sustainable practice, where today we're going to be speaking about rupture and repair in counselling. A little bit of a focus on trauma there. And then we're going to be diving into practice matters, where Rory has all beautifully teed up the interview with Ian Long. This is an interesting one. I went and did a little bit of research. I remember using the Blob people during training. So listen to that. That's going to be an interesting one. And what occurred to me is how by using the Blob people, it goes beyond language. And then into student services, where today we're focusing on you students on your journey to become a counsellor or a psychotherapist, and we're going to be speaking about rethinking transference, and of course speaking about how transference may show itself within your training, even if you're not client facing. But there we have it. Let's start off this episode, ethical sustainable practice, speaking about rupture and repair in counselling. Rory, introduce us to this topic.
Well, yes, and I think if we think of any relationship that we might have, be it with our partners or our friends or at work or even in the therapy room, no relationship is perfectly attuned. You know, there's no relationship where you're all playing off the same page, and you get misunderstandings, or, you know, emotional intensity comes into relationships and it could create a relational strain. And a rupture is where, you know, and I think we've all been through this, Ken, is where myself and my missus might not talk to each other for half the day because we've had a bit of a fallout. Now, in a relationship, you know, that a long-term relationship, you know, you that could be easily sorted out. Usually, it's me having to apologise. However, in therapy, it can happen for different reasons, and I think the one thing I want to get over is ruptures are not a sign of failure. They are a pretty normal part of therapy. If you practice long enough, you'll realise that they do come up again and again. And a rupture is where you're not tuned in to the client, or the client isn't tuned in to you. And part of that is because they may see you as a figure from their past. So we've talked a lot on the podcast about transference. The way you speak, the way you are, the way you look, may remind them of a situation or a person from their past. And also in terms of the relation, the trauma piece, it's possible, certainly as a man who's worked with a lot of women who've been through trauma, it is quite often the case that sometimes they can see me as a representation of the people who'd caused them pain. And it's that point where clients can sometimes feel either frightened, or they can be rejected, they can feel abandoned, or they can feel judged. And and I also think when the therapist gets it wrong as well, someone might use the wrong name, for instance, or say something. And what can happen is that the rupture is so powerful that the client may withdraw from therapy or not come back. And I think it's really important that we understand our own attachment patterns, our own trauma patterns, and are able to see when the rupture happens and be able to repair it, basically, be able to offer a repair.
Thank you. I like how you've laid the foundation. And would I be correct that rupture, fracture, same thing, but using different words within the relationship? Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I remember that when you're using a skill, a developed skill such as immediacy, one of the things to watch out for is that we can get it wrong in that case, and we might be looking out for a rupture or fracture within the relationship if we are using immediacy. But I think you've laid the foundations beautifully. And I was thinking about this topic, and I was thinking the following. Have you ever, you're listening to this, have you ever been in a situation where you're in a conversation with another person, and suddenly they do something, say something, or act in a certain way where there's a little trigger that goes off in you? It's like a little red flag, and you go, I've just seen something here. Almost like I can see who you really are, or I don't like that, or that doesn't align with me. So something where it doesn't align with your values or who you are or what you expected that person to be. And I wonder if you can think back to that situation where you may have just continued as normal, swallowed it down, held it inside, but yet inside you, maybe there was a slight difference in how you viewed that person going forward. And this is why this is so important. And when you were saying, Rory, about being in tune, because the attunement is recognizing it. And we'll go through the different ways that it might show in therapy in a moment, but the client is not necessarily going to throw their hands up and go, you've just said, done, or asked about something that has tripped something up in me, and now there is a fracture, or now there is a rupture in this relationship. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's like you said, Rory, that they may just stop coming, or, just demonstrate different ways of being within the session that we can pick up, that give us little clues on that, Rory. And what are the common types of a rupture that we might see so that we can know what to look out for, Rory, within therapy?
Yeah, well, I think withdrawal is a classic one, where someone withdraws, and withdrawal can be in the room. So people might sit back suddenly, pull back. I've seen that before now, where clients, or certainly in PD groups, where someone has literally moved the chair backwards or moved away. I mean, there's no stronger sign of a rupture when someone is literally moving away from you. It can be an abrupt silence, where someone just doesn't talk. It can be a defensive tone, where someone's really defensive. Or it can be where you ask something, or something happens, and the person's too quick to attend to it. And also clients changing the subject. A client may decide to go on a different path. They might be talking about some trauma that they've experienced, and all of a sudden they may be talking about the relationship with a friend. So all these are signs that at some level the client has withdrawn. They're all withdrawals, really. And as a therapist, what we need to do is to be able to look at what's going on beneath, to be able to be attuned enough to think what's shifted here, and to be able to speak about it in the room, to talk about the elephant in the room, to use a bit of a metaphor, Ken.
Yeah, I like it. And it does become the elephant in the room. And the interesting thing is, if you look at what we consider polite interaction in social society, certainly in the Western world, we don't show that. If somebody kind of does something that brings something up in us, there is a tendency to just get on with it and go, you know what, I'm just going to avoid that person. Within therapy, that's not our aim. We're there to be with that person. And I think what's important to point out here is that recognizing fracture, rupture within the therapeutic session is not a bad thing. You haven't necessarily done something wrong. In fact, sometimes you may have done something right. You may have inadvertently, or the client may have touched on a nerve of something that for them is painful to look at, something that they defend instantly without thinking about. That's a great indication that there's something underneath that. And I guess what we're called to do is the opposite of what we might do in polite conversation. Is the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say, I see this. I get this feeling. I feel like the energy in the room changed when I said. Now, we're looking to make sure that this is not just in our frame of reference. We hope that the relationship is built to a point where the client trusts us enough to be able to share the information and say, yes, actually, I didn't like it when you said that because this means X, Y, and Z to me, rather than, oh, no, that's fine. But we're looking to name it, to bring it out in the open. And then, because with it in the open, it's the only time that we can set to even begin to repair that fracture, rupture. And Rory, I wonder if there's any thoughts you have on how we might voice this within the room so that it doesn't come across as an attack or disrespectful, and certainly so that it doesn't come across as us as the counsellor trying to defend what we did and give excuses of why we said or did that.
Yes, well, I mean, I think that you make a very good point, Ken, about in the outside world, we would just disconnect from a person if we felt uncomfortable, and we would probably avoid them. In therapy, I think if we detect there's a rupture, we voice it, and it's how it's voiced. So, you know, if someone moves the chair back, you wouldn't say, why have you moved the chair back from me? Don't you like me? You wouldn't say that. What you might say is, I've just noticed that you kind of pulled back a little. I wonder what's going on in the here and now. I wonder what's happening. And what you're doing is you're inviting, very gently, inviting the client to say, well, this is how I'm feeling. And then you can explore that with them. And I think that's really important. And it is about being able to voice it. And there's one other very, very, very important thing that I think we need to talk about in rupture and repair is we need to understand our own processes, Ken. We absolutely need to know ourselves.
Oh, yes.
Because what can happen is that if the client withdraws, it may be that an old pattern of behavior comes up in us where we say, well, they don't like us. I'm not going to, I'm not going to work as hard with this client. And what happens is that the rupture becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's impossible to repair. So that's why we're asked to have our own therapy during training, and we're asked to do personal development. And that's not just in terms of our first trainings, it's a ongoing quest to understand ourselves. So understand what's going on in us and have that little conversation very quickly, and then voice it. And it's the way it's voiced, and say, I can see that you look a little tense. That's my interpretation. Just tell me what's going on. And really, and the client might say, well, it's what you said. it's what you said. You've said something and that's really upset me. And then you explore that. And the key to this is that the repair gives the client a new relational experience. So what happens is that they may not have had somebody being curious about them and asking about them in their past. When I was a child therapist, one of my clients said to me, I've never had an adult apologize to me. Just let that sink in. I've never had an adult apologize to me. And in other words, the adult was always right and the child was always wrong. What does that do to a person? And that's the essence, that's the vitamin of therapy, that you could reach out to the other and say to them, just tell me what's going on. I really want to know. And you could start that conversation. And it's sometimes referred to as the I-thou experience, where you're seeing that person as a real, vivid piece of humanity sat in front of you, and you want to connect. And it also says to clients that the relationship can survive tension and that feelings can be named safely. Something that for some people, as I began to realise as a child therapist, doesn't always happen in childhood.
Yeah. And maybe within this rupture that there's a small element of conflict that shows itself. And I think that within the counseling relationship, you can model that conflict can be used productively and doesn't have to result in shouting or slamming doors. And you can model a different way of being. And you said a magic word when you were going through that, Rory, and I'm very grateful that you did. You used an example from working as a young people and child therapist and saying you apologized. And it was the first time they heard that. And that is really important, If we step on something inadvertently, so maybe we use immediacy within a moment, and we say, I really feel as you're saying that, X, Y, and Z, and suddenly we see that person shift. We see them stiffen up. We see them move their chair back. We see the expression harden on their face, because that's attentiveness. We're watching that. That is part of being there with them. We got to bring it into the room, and a great way of bringing that into the room is when I said X, Y, Z, it seemed like that changed how you were inside, and I wonder what that was. And if they then come in and say, you know what, it's not like that, it's like this and this and this and this, we can do exactly what Rory just mentioned there, which is that I'm so sorry, I got that wrong. Just that. No excuses. Yeah. Well, I got it wrong because the thing is, you said this and that led me on to... Nope. No justification. I got that wrong. And then into the repairing. And I led into this a few moments ago, just suggesting that it's not necessarily a bad thing. And it can be, in fact, really helpful. In fact, some therapy is projected forward because a rupture is identified and repaired. So I think it is important. The big danger, you've already called it out, Rory, is when we are internalizing that as ourselves, when we're asking questions of ourselves and saying, is this me? Am I good enough? Can I really do this anymore? Do my clients like me anymore? And that's about self-work, but it is also about going to supervision and speaking about this. If these feelings are coming up for you, take them into supervision and speak to your supervisor about them. If you experience any kind of a rupture within a relationship that you had to address, take it into supervision. Speak about how you addressed that and what the learnings were from that, because I think there's great growth in facing a rupture and repairing it, Rory.
I agree. And wholeheartedly, I was kind of quietly applauding, Ken, when you were saying about accountability, and you were saying it's not, well, I'm very sorry, but this happened, or I'm very sorry, but that happened. It's about saying, I've been known to say to clients, I think I might have missed you there. In other words, what I'm saying is I missed the essence of them. You know, we weren't completely and utterly, I wasn't completely tuned into them. And I think that one of the things that repair does is deepen the therapeutic alliance. It's about trust and openness and what we all talk about, relational depth. But more importantly, I think that clients can learn that relationships can withstand difficulty, leading to greater emotional resilience. One of the lessons that I would take away from being a child therapist was that a lot of the messages that we get about rupture and repair are cemented in, concreted in fact, in childhood. And to be able to openly discuss when something's gone wrong or there's been a misattunement, and to be able to repair that rupture, I think is a great service for human beings, no matter how little you are. And it just builds more resilience. It builds more resilience knowing that you can actually repair something when it's gone wrong. So very, very important. And I'd also say that supervision is really, really important. Very, very, very important, because it's there that the mirror's held up to you, and you can think about what the process was like.
Indeed. Wow. Well, Rory has made a super duper handout for this. The title of the handout is called Rupture and Repair in Counselling Practice. And you can get this. It's free of charge. You can just download it. You go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, find your way to today's episode, which is episode 360. Right there on the page are the show notes of what Rory and I discussed today. And you can download the Rupture and Repair in Counselling Practice handout with everything we've discussed today. And that is ethical, sustainable practice. We're heading now into Practice Matters. And today in Practice Matters, Rory, you've already kind of introduced that you met with Ian Long, an illustrator for Blob Tree. Tell us what to expect here, Rory.
Well, apart from the fact that I was a little bit starstruck, Ken, because Ian's work has been part of my therapeutic journey and my training journey, and also part of my therapy journey, and also the fact that in those emotional moments through training, his illustrations were able to facilitate me talking about how I felt, something that maybe as a younger man I wasn't too good at. So if the interview sounds a little starstruck, it's because I was more than a little starstruck. And Ian tells us about the story of the Blob Tree and the Blob people and how it came to be. It's a wonderful story. And Ian Long, I think, is a wonderful man. And this is what he had to say. Today's guest's work may be familiar to many of you. If you've ever used a blob tree in your counselling sessions or in your studies, you've already encountered the creative genius of our guest. It's a great pleasure to introduce Ian Long, the artist and co-creator of the Blob Tree. Ian, thank you so much for joining us.
It's an honour to be here.
Oh, thank you very much. And I have to say, on a personal note, the Blob Tree's been part of my practice life. I started as a student 20 years ago, and the first thing I was given was the Blob Tree to work out how I felt on my very first day in class. So with that in mind, can you just give a kind of verbal, visual representation of what the Blob Tree is?
Well, the Blob Tree is made of two components. The tree itself, which represents maybe a small group, or it can represent a large body of people. And then into that tree are genderless characters. We call them blobs. And they represent either behaviour or feelings, usually a combination of the two. And they're either on their own or they're interacting with another blob. And they're either in black and white, so that they can be annotated and coloured in, or they're in colour, generally used for projection.
Yes. And what you would be, usually how they work, or how I've encountered them, is you'll be given the blob tree on an A4 piece of paper with the blob characters sitting on branches or standing around. And then the tutor would say, right, for this exercise, we'd like you to identify the character that is most meaningful for you right here, right now, and the emotion around it. Yeah.
Yeah, the key skill that whenever I do my online training with people is to teach people it's this questioning rather than the actual visual tool, which is the key, and providing open questions and in particular using what we call a menu of questions. So gradually moving people from simple observations through to more opinion and then finally personal feelings.
Yes, it's like it reminds me of the perception test, where you would ask people to look at a series of pictures and then get them to explain what emotions are invoked in that. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the origin story. What was the story behind the Blob Tree and the Blob people?
Well, this year we're celebrating our 40th anniversary. I remember when I was a very young man, at that point I was training to be an illustrator, and Pip, who was a youth worker, invited me into one of the offices in Romford YMCA. And he'd had this idea whilst he was working in the East End of London in Canning Town with a particularly difficult group of violent young people. And he wanted to help them because they were struggling to communicate verbally. And so he came up with this idea whilst he was there of a picture where people could simply touch the blob that they felt like, so that even if they didn't have the language to express how they felt, they could communicate through some kind of touching. And so it came out of that. And I remember Pip sitting me down at the desk. He was drinking his coffee and he got this idea, and I tried to visualize it. And at the end of it, he said, "Too spiky, we're going to do it again," which as a young man, I wasn't particularly keen on doing things twice. But anyway, I persisted and smoothed it out a little bit, and he liked it. And it went into one of his first books. And from there, it spread in a pre-internet age through the power of a photocopier, initially through the youth work field, and then on into other professions where people work with people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think that brings an interesting point up, because I've encountered it obviously in counselling training. I've used it in counselling training. However, it does fit in other fields. So what you mentioned social work, I think, or youth work, but what other fields is the Blob Tree and the Blob people used in?
Well, it depends on the tools, because obviously the Blob Tree is just our first tool, our primary tool. Since those days, I've created about 10,000 different visual tools, some which are in books, some are just on the internet. And each of them links to different specialities. So, for example, there's a group out in South Sudan, and they're called Ways for Change, and they're using it to help people who are dealing with the trauma of war, but using it through the means of sport. So they're using it as a way of helping children, young people to talk about their feelings. I was chatting to somebody who was working out in Syria, and they were dealing with people who were involved in the war, managing to survive, and they were using it, even though they couldn't really talk in great depth through English, they could actually communicate using the visual framework of a blob. But in terms of general professions, teaching is very popular. I trained to be a teacher, and so I produced a whole book on schools and communicating in that way. And it's, as far as I understand, it's in half the schools in the UK. So it's become a sort of a child-friendly, teenager-friendly tool for talking about their feelings. But it's also used in business. We have something called the Blob Bridge, and lots of business leaders use it as a way of talking about transitioning from one model to another. But anywhere where people work with people, you'll generally find the blobs used in some shape or form.
Wow, that's incredible. In my kind of myopic thinking, I only thought that it would be used, maybe in counselling and social work, but in the area of business, it's any, as you say, anywhere where you would be working with people. So if we think specifically of maybe counselling, and I realise that I presume this isn't your field, but how would someone introduce it in their sessions? At what point may it be useful to think the blob tree and the blob characters may be helpful to facilitate someone's emotional journey?
Well, from working with lots of different counsellors, and that's how I would sort of relate to the counselling field. The general blob tools are very good for engaging people about their feelings in a structured way. And for children and young people, it's a very helpful framework. So it can be used either at the start of a session, or particularly with children and young people who struggle to verbalise things. Some people use a counter, and then they shift the counter over the image until it lands on the blobs that they're feeling like. So it can be a tool like that. We also have things like blob cards. So just like a game of cards, you can actually engage people through a conversation, and the cards can be manipulated, reordered, sorted. The cards can be turned into a story or a game activity. So it all depends on how you're wanting to move or shift the conversation on. And certainly we provide a whole range of activities. So it could be on the topic of bereavement, and we developed a set of resources in conjunction with a West Sussex child bereavement charity, Winston's Wish. Or it could be to do with anxiety or depression. And so we've prepared resources linked to professionals who engage in that particular field. So I'd say, depending on where you're at in terms of a conversation with the person, it can either be used to help people to talk, or it can be used to focus on a particular topic.
Yes. I think the way I would have used it is maybe at the start of a training session to get people to see where they were right at the beginning, and then we'd send them out again, or we'd revisit them, and we'd say, have a look at where you are and where are you now. And then that would be the focus of either a group conversation or a piece of skills work. They're fantastically facilitative, and endlessly it develops endless curiosity. If you're ever stuck in a tree as a former counselling tutor, if I was ever stuck for a lesson, you should get the Blob Tree out, and you could go. It would generate so much interest and so much insight into people. Have you got any success stories about? Has anybody written to you about how successful or a successful session, or a general, idea of the impacts of the blob on their work?
I think in terms of individuals, we've got quite a few testimonials. What I often do is, when I do my online training, people then tell me their stories of how they've used it in their particular line of work. And out of that, often we develop new resources. So, for example, one little lad in Croydon, he contacted Pip via a tweet. He said, our school is using the topic, or going into the topic of human rights, and we find that the blobs are really good. Do you have anything specific to that topic? Well, Pip passed that on to me, and I contacted his teacher and the little lad's father, because the lad was only 8 or 9 at the time. And together we developed a whole bank of resources, and that's now being used in rights respecting schools across the whole of Europe. So sometimes it can come out of something like that, where somebody likes the blobs, and so we create new resources. Another example would be we just developed a new pack of counselling materials. I was working with a counsellor trainer, Jo McQuillan, over in Northern Ireland, and she wanted to help counsellors to visualise some of the processes and theories that are taught as part of the counselling training. And so together we developed that, and that's been published this year, and I've been doing all sorts of training on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's just fascinating in its own right. And what strikes me is the absolute reach of your work. You know, it seems to be endless, to be honest with you. Like you say, anybody who communicates with each other would benefit from the Blob Trees. Did you have any idea of how far this would go when you started as a younger man?
I had no idea. Maybe Pip did. I just saw it as a project. I was actually there painting banners for the youth workshops that we used to do, 2,000 young people. And for me, that's where my sort of heart was. This was a side project which Pip introduced on the Saturday evening. But it's been very exciting to see it sort of develop. And we were contacted in 2003 by a publisher because so many people had come knocking on their door asking for some sort of like proper resource version of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating. It was just made for necessity, and because of that, it became, well, sounds like a worldwide phenomena. One of the things that is personally interesting to me, I have a grandson who's non-verbal. He's autistic and he's non-verbal. And, you know, I think one of the things that people might love about a Blob Tree is it helps clients or children or individuals express emotions without words. Do you have any kind of insight into how the Blob Tree might have facilitated that? Do you have any stories or observations? Anybody work with non-verbal people with the Blob Tree?
Myself, not particularly, although I did use it with a child who had Down syndrome, and so communication was particularly low level. But we often used to have conversations where she would colour in the characters that she particularly identified with in response to questions we had. And so the teaching assistant would use it in that way. And because there's so many different scenarios, it enabled the teaching assistant to provide that as a framework for a conversation. I think because the blobs themselves involve the questioning of the professional who's working with the child, teenager or adult, you can adapt it into all sorts of conversations and making notes, colouring in, using counters, using the cards. And that enables even people that struggle to talk to actually have a conversation and using their finger very much as part of that way of answering the questions. And that's basically how we originally imagined it, working with very violent young people who struggle to talk, whose modus operandum was fight or flight. Suddenly they had a way of broadening their vocabulary.
Yes, and also I think that, you know, as a therapist or a former therapist myself, one of the things that I was observant of and used to teach my students as a trainer was, you know, the impact of questions. Sometimes questions can be overwhelming. Certainly direct questions can be overwhelming. And it seems to me the Blob Tree can help those who struggle and who find direct questions overwhelming. They can express themselves through these characters.
I think looking away from the person that's asking the questions and looking at something like a sheet of paper can enable them to sort of feel a bit happier, a bit more relaxed. And that's what we try and do through the questions menu, is build up that personal confidence. And also we try and encourage people to work in pairs so that they can answer a question with their talk partner first And then having sort of realised that their answer isn't too different from their friends, then they can share it with the wider group.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like there's two parts to this story. One part is the blob people themselves and the tree, but clearly the other is the skill of the person, the practitioner using it.
Yeah, definitely. We encourage everybody to rehearse, to practice whatever tool from the book that they purchased or they've picked up from somebody. Basically, always try it out yourself. Find a willing member of your friendship or family circle and try that out. And it's amazing just how rehearsing, practicing can build up a new set of skills. And I find that even now, I'm still learning because the blobs themselves can be interpreted in so many different ways. And one of the things we always say is always ask, why did you choose that? Because we might read it in a certain way, but actually the individual that you're working with or the group you're working with may see it completely different.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the whole thing about perceptual sets, that you are actually engaging with the phenomenology, the perception of another. And that, I think that's the quite powerful. I just wanted to ask, I'm sure the listeners would be interested in what happened to Pip Wilson. What's the story behind your co-creator?
Pip sadly died in 2023. He and I had worked together for about 39 years, and he really was a mentor to me. But he's left this wonderful legacy behind, and I'm continuing on with that. Thankfully, his family have remained very much in contact. And so one of the members of their family, Anne, has joined in the team and is very much sort of like taking on Pip's role within the group work.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the things that struck me, I've interviewed maybe hundreds of people on the podcast through the years, some very, very well-known practitioners, but I can't think of anybody I've ever spoken to who's impacted the profession so much without being so well known, if you'll excuse my saying that. Do you have any sense about the impact that your work and your and Pip work has contributed to the positive mental health of people? Do you get any sense of that?
Only in the sense of where it's gone. We try and track how many countries use the blobs. And the last time we went through our website to see where people had been purchasing it, there were 150 different countries. And it's very exciting. It's always very encouraging. We had the EU, one of their toolkits included the Blob Tree. And that went to over 120,000 teachers across the EU, particularly in places like the Ukraine. So it's always encouraging to hear that kind of a story.
It is. And I'd just like to say a personal thank you. Your work, person I've never met, I didn't realise until recently, connected the blob people with yourself. It helped me so much on my journey, and it's helped so many of my clients. So thank you so much. And if you're interested in Ian's work and you want to know more about the Blob Tree and the resources, if you go to counsellingtutor.com, go to the podcast tab, hit the podcast tab and look for episode 360. We'll put a link into Ian's resources so you can examine those more and maybe, who knows, build the friendly blobs into your practice. So it just goes for me to say, Ian Long, thank you so much for joining us.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com. Mass thank you to Ian Long. Thank you to you, Rory, for holding those all-important discussions, and that was today's Practice Matters. We're now going to student services, where we recognise students on their formal journey to become counsellors, psychotherapists, or to learn the skills that they can use in life applications. And today we're speaking about rethinking transference, but we're speaking specifically around person-centered therapy. Now, I'm going to be honest here, Rory. I know that when I was training, my main modality was person-centered therapy, and I was very fortunate in that transference was covered in my training course. But it's not common to cover person-centered therapy and transference together, because there are those that might suggest that they don't go together. And what might you say to those people, Rory?
I would say fiddlesticks. Is what I would say to that, Ken. The reason I brought this topic was I've talked to one or two student therapists over the last 6 months, and they've all said that transference was a brand new idea that came to them in supervision as opposed to in training. And I supervised at least one student supervisee who said that her tutor poo-pooed the idea of transference, that we don't talk about it, it's not person-centered. And I want to take you back to the pivotal moment where Rogers pivoted from being a psychoanalyst to developing what would become person-centered therapy. And it was when he was working in the children's home in New York. And the story goes that he was speaking to a mother about her son who was having really bad behavioural difficulties. And he said to her, the reason he's having behavioural difficulties is because of your early rejection of him. So he'd analysed the situation. He'd used expertise to analyse. And the mother wasn't having any of it. She left rather angrily. And then she returned saying to Rogers, do you take on adults for therapy? To which he said yes. And that's how the story of person-centered therapy goes. Now, here's the thing, Ken. Didn't mean Rogers was wrong when he did the analysis. Didn't mean he was wrong. It may very well be that the child was acting out because the mother rejected him. But what he didn't do was focus on the transference. What he focused on was what the here and now experiencing of the mother was. And Rogers absolutely definitely spoke about transference. In fact, I've got a quote here, and it says, clients frequently react to me, not as I am, but as someone else in their past. These responses are not something I interpret. That's the key. I don't interpret them, but something I accept, understand, and respond as part of their experiencing. And effectively, very simply, he reframed them. You know, he used unconditional positive regard, congruence, a non-judgmental approach to be able to put himself in a position in the therapy room where the client could talk about what was going on. And, you know, Rogers wrote about it in client-centered therapy, wrote about it in on becoming a person. He wrote papers on it. The difference is he didn't interpret. That's the key. He didn't interpret the transference. He just saw it was there and worked with it. And I think that's the big difference. I sometimes think that subtlety may be missed. Maybe.
Yes, very much so. So it does fit in if you are a person-centered therapist, this theory. Transference, when someone responds to you based on past relationships rather than who you are right now in the here and now. And I think your example of from Carl Rogers is just perfect. Sometimes clients reply to me as if I was someone else. It's exactly that. And I guess what we're talking about here is not necessarily analyzing this topic and having a deep understanding of transference and counter transference, dare I say, by the end of this chat. It's more about noticing this within yourself and being able to identify and work with what might come up with you during your counseling training. And I guess why this matters is you don't have to be in client contact to observe and feel the transference and counter-transference. It can show up for you as a student in role play. It can be work that you're doing with peers in a project kind of setting where you've got a project to do and you're with peers. It's going to be dependent on those interactions and what comes up for you. And of course, it may come up in skills practice, not just in real therapy. And some examples of this is students experiencing that wanting to impress, show that I know what I'm doing, and wanting to be the therapist. I'm using quotes in the air as I do that. Maybe it shows itself of a fear of doing it wrong. Maybe it's acting like a teacher amongst peers, taking on that role, or maybe it's being a rescuer for fellow peers. These might be indications for a little bit of a closer look. But I guess, why should a student understand to be able to see this and observe this during their training, Rory? How does it key into training at all, really?
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Well, I think it keys in because it's a key part, it's a cornerstone of the therapeutic alliance, the therapeutic relationship. And I think that what can happen is, if it's not explained with examples, I think it's, I think when I taught it, we taught it, I explained it with examples. What can happen is that, as we said at the top of the podcast, the relationship can fracture. And that will either lead to the client withdrawing or the client leaving, and or the therapist having really unresolved feelings towards the clients. And I think that, what I would say is that transference goes both ways. As a student, how many people have I supervised who've said, I'm really frightened of this client? And they've said, okay, have they said anything or done anything? No, I was frightened of them. And through the supervision, it's come up that, sure enough, the client reminds the therapist of someone from their past. One I can remember very clearly was that the therapist was so frightened of the client, even though they'd done absolutely nothing at all, that they were literally scared of seeing them again. And it turns out that the client was wearing a scent that the student's abuser had worn, and it triggered a trauma reaction. So it's really, really important, not only for client safety, but our safety or therapist safety, that we understand that these processes enact. And the thing with transference is, it's largely subconscious, Ken. It's largely out of our awareness. So we don't actually think what's going on. We feel it. And it's only at distance then when you're in supervision and someone says, so tell us what's going on. Well, I felt this and I felt that. And then you start to unpack it. And I think as through your own therapy and through the training and understanding it, it becomes more visible. So it's still a subconscious process. It may start as for the client, a very uneasy feeling, but we can see what's going on in the tone of the interaction or the non-verbal communication, and we're able to be able to speak about it. And a classic one is, I work with a lot of female clients who'd been subject to sexual assault by males, and as they were telling me how they were feeling, it became quite clear that there was not only a reticence, but also the trauma was starting to resurface. And I used to just say, how does it feel talking about this to another man, to me? And that conversation was, well, in some cases, all the men I've ever met have just been horrible to me.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was then that's where, that we talked about rupture and repair. That's where that's where the transference is reworked. That it becomes a realization that this is the past presenting past, not the here and now. And I think that's important. But the key thing is not to interpret.
It is. And you're bringing you're bringing examples there from practice. We call them sanitized examples.
Oh yeah.
From practice, that whenever we bring an example. But we're speaking to you as students, and you may not be in practice. You may not have seen that first client, and that it doesn't mean that transference might not show itself, or countertransference might not show itself. And it's really good to be recognizing it at this stage. Like you said, Rory, you don't need to interpret it. There's no need to, unless of course you're on a course that is calling for you to do that. And we're speaking now specifically. We started this saying you're on a person-centered course, but no need to dive deep into it, but just to understand it and say, hey, what is this feeling in me? You're 100% right, Rory. It's invisible transference, countertransfers. We don't see them. We feel them. And it might be that we feel that we're being overly responsible, overly helpful, hesitant, defensive. These can be indicators that we can explore. And they could be seen as early hints at countertransference, all of those kind of feelings that I've just described there. So how this affects the learning journey is, I guess, that it helps you realize as a student that there is more to therapy than just the skills that we say. It's a relationship, and it's got dynamics, and it's forever changing within the room. It builds our emotional awareness as a student counselor or psychotherapist, and it having that understanding before we go into real clinical work really helps us, because we have foundation stones to go, okay, this is normal, because it can play out in us. We're feeling something when that client is there, or we see it reflect in them. And it reduces that self-blame when something feels odd in a session. It might be a relational pattern, not a mistake that you have made. It could be transference that is acting itself out there. And I guess, Rory, if you were in practice and this was showing itself, what you'd be looking for is to go to your supervisor and have a chat about this. What would you suggest? I'm a student. I'm on a level 3 counselling course. I'm not yet in practice. I'm not placement. I don't have a supervisor at the moment. Yet, when I'm doing group work, things are coming up for me. When I do personal development groups, stuff is coming up for me. How do I explore this without having a clinical supervisor, Rory?
Well, I think that CPD is the breakfast of champions, as we always say on the podcast, or at least I always say on the podcast. Get some CPD around it. Get some continuing professional development. I know that in the CSR library, the Counselling Study Resource Library, which we have for students, we have quite a lot of resources on transference. And I think that it's useful to understand it, and to, obviously, I'm sure there's a lot of great tutors out there who teach it and outline it much as we have, Ken, to the students, to say that we shouldn't interpret, we should just work with it. But I think in terms of personal development, and to know when it comes into us, I think interpretation is a good idea for ourselves. So I will quite often go out and my wife will say, do I think I've had some transference there. I think that person reminded me of a situation or a person. And that's kind of self-analysis, which I think is great for self, not particularly analysing in the therapy room. But CPD, find out about it. If you're not being taught transference, I'd respectfully ask the tutor if they're going to cover it, because it's a real thing. And I think it's a missing part. If it's not taught, then it's a cornerstone of the work that's missing. It's like trying to build a building without a foundation, in my view, in my humble opinion. But get some CPD around it, get to understand it. And here's the thing, why not bring it up in your personal development group? If you're feeling that you meet someone and they're bringing up a feeling for you, it's a great place, personal development group, to be able to talk about it and to try and get a sense of what's going on for you as a route, one of the routes to personal development, I guess.
100%, Rory. That's exactly what this is. It's a personal development opportunity. The only place it's going to be worked on is in your own personal development. So just some thinking points. Transference is already happening, even if you're just practicing with classmates or involving yourself in group work. Here's what you can do. Notice the pulls, the urge to rescue, the urge to impress, withdraw, perform. Notice those feelings coming up in yourself and note them. You're not doing anything wrong. You're learning about yourself, and you're learning how relationships can shape a session. And it's less about analyzing for now and more about developing your awareness and your steadiness and your understanding of self. And of course, your skills practice is a very special time. It's your training ground to recognize all of these currents that happen, these energies that flow. And you quite rightly said, Rory, journal about it. Look at it in your personal development time. And maybe there is an opportunity to mention how you're feeling in your personal development group work, where you all sit around and say what's coming up for you. That's actually what personal development is for. Yeah. It's to kind of speak about all the emotions and things that have come up with for you in a safe place. And you wouldn't want to bring it out as a somebody else's fault caused this. You can just say, today during an activity, I noticed this overwhelming feeling to rescue. I actually remember this. This has just triggered a memory. Oh my goodness, Rory! This has triggered a memory from my training, and we were doing and this was group work. And we were putting together a group kind of presentation for something. I don't remember what it was for exactly, but I remember what I felt, and it was I wanted to kind of take control of the whole thing and just get it done, And I recognize how uncomfortable that was for me. But I do remember saying that in personal development group and saying, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but this is the feeling that came up for me. And the empathy that was received with, I guess maybe gave me permission to look at it not as a fault. It's not something wrong with me that I feel this way, just how I react in certain situations. And I think I handle those kind of situations differently now. With that knowledge, learning, and understanding. Yeah. Final thoughts, Rory?
Well, the final thoughts are transference is all around us, in our relationships, even in objects that we see. You can have object transference where you see a phone box and you're taken back to being a child, maybe. So it's a phenomenon that lives with us. We are biological time machines, but I think it's incumbent on us to try and anchor ourselves into the here and now. The past is gone. There's no future living in the past, as I famously said. We live in the here and now, and I think that's really important. But to call it out, I think that my final thoughts would be, if there is transference, as my wife often says as we drive along, I think I'm having some transference, Rory. And I've got, all right, okay, what's that about? And my wife's not a therapist, but, she knows enough about it to be able to understand. It's wonderful. She understands her own process. To be able to speak about it and to be able to say, this is what I'm feeling, and I think this is why I'm feeling it. And as you say, if it's received with empathy and understanding, it really is a point of growth, as you quite rightly outlined, and it sets you off on your journey. So call it out.
Wow, there it is. Thank you, Rory. This has been episode 360 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started off with ethical, sustainable practice, and we talked about rupture and repair in counselling, and we explored how we repair, what ruptures are and how we repair them. In Practice Matters, I met with Ian Long, the co-author of the Blob Tree, probably one of the most famous counselling resources that exists. I think every student has used the Blob Tree at some point in their training, and we got to the story and the history of why the Blob Tree was invented. A wonderful, wonderful story, and a lovely man. And in student services, person-centered therapy, rethinking transference, a little bit of a observation that transference should be taught in person-centered courses as a way of identifying issues that might come up either in training or in client work. And it is a part of person-centered therapy. It was talked about by lots of authors, and how it is worked with in a person-centered way. We thank you for your likes, subscribes and shares. And until the next time we meet, stay grounded and stay safe.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.